Greetings and hello. This is the first Fireside Chat of day 2. And with me, I'm very honored to have Kelly Brown with us. And before we even dive to the whole conversation on higher education, educational leadership in an era of AI, Kelly, you'll help me pronounce your name quite well.
Yeah,
Please introduce yourself, tell us who you are and why you're here.
awesome. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. My name is Kaylee Brown. I work at Pearson, the education company, and a part of the company called Pearson Labs. So what we do is we work across all of our divisions, all of our products, trying to figure out how emerging technologies like AI, like VR, can be applied to help our learners and our teachers kind of solve their biggest problems. So I'm obviously passionate about AI and about kind of implementing it in the classroom and in ways that are very efficacious and helpful to not only teachers but students and all other stakeholders as well.
Wow, thank you. We're very honored to have you here. Thank you for setting up your precious time to gather with us. Now, shall we dive deep into our questions?
Yes, let's
Okay.
do it.
So, in your experience as an educator and passionate about AI, how can educational leaders adapt their roles to guide institutions effectively in this rapidly AI landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. Something that I harp on quite a lot is responsible use of AI. I know initially when ChatGPT first really came on the scene and started getting widely adopted, there was a lot of pushback from educational institutions to ignore it and prohibit it and stop it from being used. Luckily, that mindset has kind of been shifting and fading in educational organizations, and they're opening up more to using AI in the classroom, which I think is a great move. I think it's all about how you use the tool with anything. It can equally do good and it can equally do bad. So I think that leaders and teachers need to design learning experiences embedding AI in the process so students not only learn how to use it, but that they use it in the right ways. And when I say responsible use of the tool, what I really mean is that it's human nature to pull things from the tool that confirm some of your own biases. So designing experiences that really challenge that. So for example, having ChatGPT create two different opposing viewpoints on whether something like uniforms in school is a good thing or a bad thing. And then having a student read through both of those and kind of discussing with other students what their opinion is on it. Coming up with a consensus within that group and presenting, suddenly you're hitting a lot more of the Common Core than just, writing or essays. You're kind of teaching students to be more critical thinkers and to, kind of follow along that kind of train of thought. And even beyond that, something that my group at Pearson has really been talking a lot about recently is using AI beyond trying to improve old processes. So I think that the first use case people think of when they think of AI is trying to make old processes better. So for example, like AI grading assessments. But I think that if you go back to the core problems that you're trying to solve and try to create new processes using AI in a different way, how can you use AI to create better outcomes? What's, leaving behind the old constructs and finding the best way to solve these problems using the new technologies that we have available and kind of getting out of that old kind of way of thinking.
I love that perspective where you said you create AI, a scenario whereby AI acts as the opposing side, and the student battles that reasoning with it. It's quite very impactful, and also creating new processes. It's not just about advancing old processes, but also trying to find new processes of doing things. But as we just talk about that, I'm wondering. Uh, I'm in Africa. I'm going to be honest, accessibility here is still a challenge. We do have accessibility, I have one, but there's still a huge part of the world, not only in Africa, that doesn't have accessibility. How do we address these disparities in access to AI powered educational tools, resources for learners worldwide?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a tough question. I think if it were an easy question to answer, we probably would have solved it by now. But I think in terms of using AI and knowing how to use AI, there's not much training needed in order to access some of the benefits. And before anyone is kind of annoyed about, prompt engineering is a thing and you need to be taught, I think that doing those classes and having that training is helpful to jump the learning curve. But what those courses really do is to help us to kind of get those benefits faster, but you can still reach that just by experimenting, playing around with the tool. AI can teach you how to prompt it and all of those sorts of things. But I think in terms of physical access to the technology, which is more what you're talking about, I think is that there's issues even in the US, in rural schools where they don't have access to good internet, or computer access for students with, in lower socioeconomic classes. But these point to a larger infrastructure issue that exists with any technology, new or not. And so I think or I know that there are grants and funding available and organizations that are working to try and solve this problem. But as long as you have some kind of access to internet, whether that's at a public library or, elsewhere, and a technology-enabled device like a phone even, you should be able to access at least basic AI tools. But even beyond that, and even in the last session, y'all were talking about mindset. I think that that is sometimes a bigger issue to solve than the physical access to technology is how do you enable people, everybody, to feel like they can play with AI and that they have the skills and the confidence and that they know enough about data privacy and how to protect themselves to be able to access these tools. And I don't mean that to sound like flippant or like it's simple because that's sometimes a bigger issue. But how do we, create a security blanket for people to go in and be able to play around with this? And this all goes back to education, which obviously is the most important piece for me in all of this.
Yeah. It is the most important piece. I agree that. And you have mentioned something about security, and this drives me to the conversations of ethical training too. How should educational leaders approach the ethical challenges posed by integrating AI into learning environments?
Yeah, I think there's multiple meanings to this sort of word of ethical. Are we talking about cheating? Are we talking about security? Do we mean how do we use it with teaching, how we communicate with each other? And I think there's different answers for each. So just starting with the easiest one for me to answer, which is cheating, because I get asked about it a lot. And I think it goes back again to the first part of our conversation that it's about designing the experience. And if you do that with AI in mind, then there's no way a student really can cheat because you're relying on their own thoughts and their own critical thinking skills in more of a discussion forum. So they can't easily use AI to replicate that because it's so focused on the individual. It's not about what AI thinks, it's about what the student, you as a student think. And so that kind of brings in how teachers use it. And I think there's two different facets to this. And the first is that with the limited time teachers have in their work, a lot of reuse of lesson planning happens, which is totally fair. I taught school back in the day. My mom was a teacher, so I'm very empathetic to that problem that teachers face. But I think if you're using AI, you need to use it not to augment old lesson plans, but the lesson plans need to be designed around AI with that in mind so you can get the best outcomes. And then the second thing is, ethically using it to communicate. So there's a potential for a loss of trust between a student and a teacher if a teacher uses just AI to communicate with students and students are just using AI to communicate with teachers. That trust needs to be maintained. And so AI can be used in the process, absolutely, to help shorten that time, but there always needs to be a human in the loop. And then I think with security, again, we talked a little bit about this, but just teaching students, having it embedded in their learning process of don't put this in the tool, put this in the tool, this is what it should be used for. Here's how that data may be used on the back end. And that's something that largely we haven't really been teaching in schools. It's not a Common Core standard to know how your data could be used against you, right? So.
Yeah, very, very, very insightful. And I want to do a follow up on that. You mentioned a place where trust can be lost, a scenario whereby teachers are using AI to communicate to students, and students are doing the same. Do you see that scenario happening? And how can we mitigate that before it happens?
Yeah, I think that teachers obviously have a lot on their plate. And so I think that there is a very strong temptation there to do that, especially when it comes to grading. So putting a student essay in an AI tool and having it grade it and come out with something else. And it's something that my mom was using, right? But she was very careful. And I think that it just being aware of it and knowing that there is a trust there, an implicit trust between teacher and student that should remain, right? That is a common thread to a student's educational experience, right? So using that again, but making sure that it sounds like you, that you are the one reading through that you're engaging with the student in more ways. And maybe it's not just grading it, but you can engage with the student in other ways, especially since a lot of that administrative burden can be taken off by AI. You can now use that time to, be more communicative and build that relationship even more.
Wow, I hope that scenario doesn't happen, but thank you for sharing that insight. We already know what to do if that happens. Speaking of adapting these systems of AI and even teachers themselves adapting to it and students, what strategies can educational systems adopt to prepare students and educators for an AI-driven future?
Yeah, it's a good question. Another great question. All these questions are amazing. But I think that this is an output of the lesson planning and design that I mentioned before. But in addition to that, I know that there's a concern about AI killing creativity or creative thinking. And the students will just offload everything in academics and hand it over to AI, but I'm ever the optimist. And so I'm in a slightly different camp on this. I think that there's two ways in which AI actually improves cognitive functions. So using AI and figuring out how to use it, that process is problem solving and its adaptability. Which is exactly what the skills are that are needed for the future. And again, these things are in the educational system, but not incentivized in the right way with the current system that we have, because with the assessments that we're given, it's about Common Core. And teachers need to have those Common Core state standards, whether they accurately prepare students for the future or not. So I think that there needs to be a shift more toward this idea of, students pick a career before they enter college, work in that career for the rest of their lives. That idea is long dead. And like, for example, like, who do you know that still works in the same career that they thought they would when they first got into college, right? So we need to be preparing students for more uncertain futures. And sort of that's where this idea, not only of AI literacy comes in, but just those ideas of, soft skills. So I know there's called soft skills. Some people call them portrait of a graduate. What I've heard best described is as training students to become creative generalists. So teaching them problem solving, teaching them critical thinking, use AI to augment current processes. And I think AI offers us a huge advantage in that instead of people starting from this base level of knowledge, we now can start them from this base level of knowledge. They have all of that AI behind them. And now it becomes more about what is uniquely human? What can we add to the system? And how is that? And that's what's really going to count in the coming years, because a lot of the careers that are currently available won't be available. And there are careers that we can't even fathom right now that will be available. So how do you teach students to be flexible and to be able to enter into those new areas?
Yeah, as our times goes by, I could spend so much time with you here, but I want to do also a follow-up on, you mentioned the system, the current education system that we have right now, and we do acknowledge there's a gap. Do you see the current education system itself, the system itself, coming to a point where soft skills are prioritized more than career skills, or the traditional way of doing things, choosing a career that you'll do for a long time, which is now impossible? Do you see that system coming into place?
Absolutely. So I think that we're seeing a lot of change triggers toward people wanting to move more into a future focused system. And I think that that's really evident in places like charter schools and private schools. And that's always where innovation starts, within the system, right? Because they have a little bit more freedom. They're not reliant on public funding in a lot of cases, right? That they can kind of start shifting mindsets. There's a school called Alpha Schools in Austin, where I live. That is kind of doing a little bit of that, right? Using AI to augment processes, preparing students for a future. They have the second half of the day focused on experiential learning, which is exactly what is needed in order to, create these critical thinking, all these soft skills training. So I think that we are at a point now, especially, we've been at a point for several years where the education system just really needs to change. And I know there are a lot of people pushing toward that, but education, the larger system itself, is sometimes one of the last to change, right? As education and government kind of go hand in hand, and they're a little bit slower to pick up on some of this stuff. So I think that it needs to change, and it will change, but currently those changes are kind of focused only on the higher socioeconomic classes, because that's who can afford this kind of education. And so I think that it's about making that accessible across the entirety of the system that's going to be the difficulty.
That is very quite true, very true. And someone was talking about that yesterday. Not sometimes, the government or maybe the systems that we found, they take time before they adapt to the new systems. And I also believe it's an opportunity for people like you and what you are doing right now to champion these changes. And we appreciate you, Kylie. Kaylee, sorry for that.
No.
Thank you for spending your precious time with us, dropping some gems. We're happy to have you again. So, our audience, please engage with Kylie, follow her. There's her LinkedIn back on the backdrop, and we were very happy to have you, Kylie. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much, Lynn. So happy to be here. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Well,